Hello, my name is Dr. Kurt Hulett, and I couldn't be more excited to be with you here today. Let me get my notes up real quick. I want to thank the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina for partnering with Rethink Ed on this webinar today. As I mentioned, I am Dr. Kurt Hulett, and I'm a lifelong advocate for kiddos with disabilities. I currently work in support of and partner with kiddos, parents, and school districts to ensure kiddos get their unique needs met. Primarily, again, I support parents when they want and need additional support in the IEP process. And I also work a great deal and train school district personnel on the issues of compliance, IEP development, intervention approaches, things of that nature. And I absolutely love what I do. And today we're going to talk about two primary topics in order to help you better serve your kiddos with behavioral and emotional needs. Now we're going to look at compliance, which will involve implementation, procedural, and substantive issues, with substantive being the most important. Two, we're going to talk about the development of the IEP that results in a compliant, meaningful, and impactful educational program. As this is a pre-recorded session, please still type any questions you may have in the chat box, and they will be emailed to me at Rethink Ed. Without further ado, let's dive into our virtual discussions surrounding behavior goals in IEPs and everything that matters related to that topic. So let me grab my information here real quick and let me pull up my notes and we will get started. So let's first begin by talking a little bit about FAPE, how it's violated and how the courts and hearing officers evaluate FAPE, because that's critical. And at the end of the day, the worst case scenario is that there isn't a solid program in place for a kiddo, or we haven't implemented it correctly, collected data, and done what we said we would do in the IEP. So essentially, it's really important that we understand this. And in recent history, some things have adjusted. So the first thing we look at, or the hearing officers in courts look at, is they use what's called the Raleigh-Andrew FAPE standard. And the Raleigh case, some of you may remember, came out in 1982, and it was the Amy Raleigh. It was actually a related services case. But what they ended up saying was that when it comes to providing support, services, things of that nature, the school district really has to do the bare minimum and essentially not do harm. But what really came out of that was that procedures matter. So when it comes to timelines, and let's say in a state like Texas, you have 45 days to evaluate a kiddo once the initial evaluation is consented to and the district is initiating it. And it takes them 48 days or 50 days or 51 days. That can be an issue, and that would be a procedural violation. Now, that is what came out of Raleigh. And then we also have a relatively new component that came out of the Andrew F. case of 2017. Again, a Supreme Court case. And this was really critical because it added language that we never had before, relative essentially to the quality of the IEP. Whereas again, in Raleigh, they didn't mention that. And essentially, it's what we call substantive requirement. And in order to meet the substantive requirement under IDEA, a school district must develop, in quotes, an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So there's a lot packed into that statement. And one, reasonably calculated. Is there data? Are the services reasonable? We'll talk a little bit more about internal consistency. Does it connect? Does it make sense? Does the program serve the kid based on their needs? Again, was a reasonable plan of attack developed to help this child? And then it says, make progress in light of the child's circumstances. So one, we didn't have to show progress prior to 2017. We just had to show we didn't do damage. So now there is a progress requirement where children need to grow, whether it's behavior, whether it's academics. If it's in the IEP, you have to demonstrate growth essentially. And then in light of the child's circumstances really comes down to, you know, if you have a child with Down syndrome, their growth may look different in, say, reading than a child with a mild learning disability. So what they're saying is you have to take into account the child's unique needs and circumstances. All that said is that has basically created this two-part test, which says you have the procedural over here expectations where you have to follow the rules, which we're really good at in education. We've been doing it a long time. And then you have the substantive component over here, which is the quality and demonstrating growth. Now, the substantive is much newer to us, and we are much less proficient in this area, and in particular when it comes to children with behavioral issues, children with emotional issues, AU children, in my humble opinion. It's just what I've observed. And then lastly, even though we're going to focus mostly on substantive, the two-part test is really procedural and substantive. There's another component that does matter, and it's implementation. And that has to do with whether or not the district is doing what they said they would do. Are they actually implementing the IEP accurately as it's written? So, you know, again, what do procedural errors mean? What have the courts said? And basically, the procedural procedures are a central feature of the IDEA process, not a mere afterthought. And that's what was said in MC Antelope Valley High Union School District, 9th Circuit. Procedural violations that interfere with parental participation in the IEP formulation process undermine the very essence of the IDEA and are essential to ensuring FAPE. And essentially, when IDEA was developed, a big part of it was ensuring parental rights, ensuring that things were done in a reasonable time frame, and ensuring they had redress of grievance, that they could bring an argument, that there was a process to disagree with the district. And so essentially at the beginning, it was really important that the rules were followed. And again, schools really do a nice job of this. So there haven't been a ridiculous amount of FAPE errors from 1975 through 2017, because again, substantive really wasn't a major issue that was evaluated. You know, in a quote, you know, a decision made by a hearing officer, decisions shall be made on substantive grounds based on a determination of whether a child received a free, appropriate public education. Now that comes out of the statute of IDEA. And what that is saying is that, and this is really interesting, you can have a procedural error where the rules weren't followed. And again, as an example, let's say the procedural requirement is that you have 45 days to evaluate a kid who you believe may have a emotional disturbance, behavioral disorder, however we define it. And instead of taking 45 days, you take 50 days. Well, at the end of the day, the question is, did that really have an impact on the kid? Did it delay major services that the child needed? And what it says now is that if that procedural error didn't really have a major impact on the kiddo, a procedural error in and of itself isn't going to be a FAPE violation. It has to have a impact, a substantive, significant impact on the child. So the really nice thing about this is that for years, schools lived in fear of missing, you know, anything by a day, any major step or minor step in the process. And so we have gotten, again, very good at it, but there was a lot of fear. And now what's in the statute is what I just think is reasonable. And again, it shouldn't be a FAPE violation if a district misses a couple days and it doesn't really affect the kid. So that's really important to understand that, again, procedural in and of itself is not a FAPE violation. It has to have or cause substantive harm. So no harm, no foul. And basically, what does this, how do they look at it? And basically, if the violations impede a student's right to a FAPE, if it caused a deprivation of educational benefits, if significantly impedes parents' rights to participate. And remember, that's critical, that when it comes to a child with emotional disturbance and the development of that IEP, if the parent can demonstrate that they have not been fully involved in the process, that in and of itself can be a FAPE violation. So it's very important that we do involve our parents and value their input and opinion. Now, what is substantive? How do we essentially define it? What goes into it? And to me, substantive is what matters. And the reason it matters is I've never even liked the term compliance, because to me, what that says is we have to do the bare minimum for our kids. That's compliance. Did we check all the boxes? Well, none of us are in this business to be compliant. We want to help our kiddos the most we possibly can. So substantive to me is what matters in the IEP process. So again, the procedural matters, but again, if it takes 48 days instead of 45 days to evaluate a kid, does that really matter? Not in my humble opinion. However, if you don't have a solid PLAF and present level, and you don't have good data, and you don't have baselines, and then you don't link those baselines to solid measurable annual goals, and then you don't have services to support the collection of data to measure and monitor those goals, all of these things matter. So again, to me, substantive is what matters. And that is what the IDEA, the hearing officers in courts, have determined matters. So again, let's talk just a little bit about it. And again, what substantive really looks at is the content of the IEP. And it focuses on the adequacy of a student's IEP in terms of its likely or actual results. For example, IEP based on a student's needs as identified in his/her PLAF statements. The IEP includes measurable and ambitious annual goals. We'll talk a little bit about that later. That's super critical. Reasonably ambitious goals. Data is collected to monitor a student's progress. The data is reported and acted upon. Another critical element, and another quote that came out of, again, Andrew, that is so important to understand, is that to meet its substantive obligation under the IDEA, a school must offer an IEP reasonably calculated, again, built reasonably to enable a child to make progress, another huge term, appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. And again, that's out of Andrew F. 2017 Supreme Court case. So the last piece I want to mention when we talk about compliance is implementation. And one of the things I see quite often with kids with behavioral issues is that I can't find data. So we have goals. Sometimes we have a lot of goals, but I can't find data. And then when I do find data, what I don't find is that we're making significant adjustments based on the data. So let's say we have a goal to decrease verbal outbursts, and we want to replace that goal with that issue with a replacement behavior, and we want the child to share their concern, again, to essentially not do that behavior and put another behavior in place of it. So we're going to track the decrease of one and the increase of another. And if we see that those verbal outbursts are going up, we should change our approach, our intervention, our strategy to, one, decrease the undesirable behavior and increase the replacement behavior. But so often we don't do that. And that is the intent of gathering data. Why gather the data if we're not going to make adjustments? So let's now move into substantive compliance, as well as the development of the quality IEP for a child with behavioral or emotional concerns. And again, let me begin by saying, in my experience, as I work with school districts, particularly who are focused on improving the quality of their IEPs and improving overall compliance, but they're really focused on their kiddos, what I find is we struggle probably the most with behavioral IEPs. For whatever reason, it's a challenge. The disabilities that the children have can be challenging. It can be hard to understand. The other thing I find is that it's really quite interesting when we deal with, a learning disability. We have a lot of compassion and kindness, but sometimes with the behavioral disabilities, there are overt behaviors that can be bothersome to educators. They can be distracting. They can disrupt the classroom environment. And so sometimes we lose sight that is a disability the child is struggling with, and we almost take it personally. And so we really have to remember, again, these are disabilities, these are disorders. Quite often there are mental health issues involved. And we need to remember that, again, these are kiddos who are struggling with these challenges. So let's talk about what matters in the IEP relative to substantive compliance, and then how to improve an IEP for a kid with a behavioral disorder. So the first thing that's super important is that we start with the PLAF. Now, the PLAF, which is, of course, the present level of academic achievement and functional performance, or what most folks just call the present level, is I've seen a real decline over the years in the quality of the data, the quality of the information, the description of the child. And remember, the idea of the present level has multiple facets. One, it's supposed to tell the educators, particularly those who are new to the kiddo, what the child is like, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, where they struggle, where they excel, what they're like. And remember, this is quite often the only information they have prior to working with a child with a disability. So the present level also is supposed to have the baselines. Now, let's say we give a BASC-3 and, we have our T-scores, we have our measures. Well, you got to remember that the BASC-3, you can't progress monitor. So you can't progress monitor a T-score, at least to my knowledge, you can't. And it's not something that an educator can do on the fly. So one of the things you have to do is get baseline data. So if you have, again, a child that's having verbal outbursts, you're going to need, frequency, time, intensity, duration, and at a minimum frequency. How many times does it happen in a given amount of time? And then you need to be able to track that up or down. If you don't have that in the baseline or in the PLAF, how do you have a baseline for your goals? And quite often what I will see is the obligatory 70%. Every goal set to 70%. Well, it's kind of like if we were setting up physical fitness plans for kiddos that had weight issues, and we said every kiddo is going to lose the exact same amount of weight this year. Every kid will lose 40 pounds. That's a lot of weight. Now, if you have a long way to go, that might be reasonable. But for a lot of kids, that would not be reasonable. So why do we apply the same proficiency to every kid's goals? Got to wonder about that. The other thing to remember when it comes to goals and setting baselines in your PLAF is that a grade in a class is not a goal. That's a grade for gen ed or special ed. It's a grade. So make sure we stay away from proficiency of 70% in mathematics. We need to really hone in on the kids' unique needs, get the baselines, and really make sure that it's completely accurate as to how this disability is impacting the child. Because what I also see a great deal of is that when these kids transition to another school, this is all they have. And the teachers are often not reading the technical reports, the BASC-3 reports, the full individual evaluation. They're reading the PLAF and the goals. So again, if you don't start with a robust PLAF that really helps understand the kiddo and how the disability is impacting them, it's really hard to move forward. Next, I talked about baselines. We need measurable and defendable baselines in the PLAF. Now, that doesn't mean it is an estimate. It doesn't mean it's an average. It means that we have collected data or have a data metric that tells us exactly where the kiddo is in that. And it can be as simple as, again, going back to verbal outbursts or say physical aggression. The child averages 2 physical aggression outbursts per day. the child has 4 verbal outbursts per day or per hour or per 20 minutes, however we want to do it. That is measurable. But saying that the kiddo is going to have less than 3 verbal outbursts without knowing where they're starting, well, are they starting at 4? Are they starting at 3? Are they starting at 20? Because remember, in Intro F, it says that the goals have to be reasonably ambitious. If we don't have the baseline, we don't know what is reasonably ambitious, and the school can really get hit on that. So again, measurable and defendable baselines. And then here's the other thing, make sure you can provide evidence of it. I have been in IEPs where I've challenged, because it was clear to me it was a copy and paste goal. It was clear to me there was no baseline. And when asked for the documentation, they couldn't provide it. Make sure you have the documentation available. Here's another huge area that matters a lot. How the disability affects student in the general ed curriculum is in or a part of the PLAF, or it's a separate statement. This is, again, a federal requirement, state requirement. And so often, I don't see really solid statements that fully explain. So if you have a kid with a behavioral disability, again, emotional challenge, what you want to talk about is, say, in English, Stephen really struggles with social interaction. Stephen has loud verbal outbursts that disrupt the class. It makes it very hard for Stephen to stay on task, comprehend what he's reading, stay focused on content, makes socialization very difficult, brings negative attention. You want to explain how the disability impacts the kid in that gen ed environment. So again, think through exactly what they're asking. So let's also talk about, does each identified deficit, academic, functional, behavioral, have a measurable goal that is linked to the baseline in the PLAF or a service? So I'll give you an example. I was in an IEP very recently, and we're going through the full individual evaluation, and there's copious amounts of data, a child with autism, that indicates the child is in the severe range on teacher ratings for socialization. The BASC-3 has some very, very concerning scores. There's the P-body, there's the SSR. All of the data indicates significant issues. Well, the district did not present any goals, and there were no services. What they argued was that the child, was doing okay. All of the data indicated differently. Remember, the data is what drives goals. It's what drives services, and we can't ignore data. So one of the things, again, we have to make sure of is that we're linking this together, and this is what we call internal consistency. If I have that in the PLAF, again, that Johnny is really struggling and is having a lot of verbal outbursts and is disrupting class, do I have a goal that addresses verbal outbursts? When I look at services, do I have any SDI, specifically designed, specially designed instruction to address that need? Do I have socialization skills or training? Again, it should all link together. So if in the PLAF, I'm talking about the severe needs of this kiddo, and this child has physical aggression, verbal outbursts, elopement, runs up and down the hallways, has severe meltdowns, on and on and on. And then I have 10 minutes of consult with the district social worker. Do those two things match up? Not at all. So again, it needs to all match up and link. And just as a reminder, gang, all of this is what we call substantive compliance. Does it make sense? Does it all link together? Is the IEP reasonably calculated with reasonably ambitious goals? So this is super critical. The other piece that I often don't see is we will see, again, goals for either behavior, social, but all within that realm. And again, I can't find the baseline. So if you say that Johnny is not going to have more than 2 physical aggression outbursts per day, well, again, what is the baseline? Is it 8? Is it 10? Is it 12? It just has to be reasonable. There's no formula, but if essentially the kiddo had 3, that's not reasonably ambitious, and that can be a real issue, and it needs to make sense. Is physical evidence available for each baseline? Again, when I see in an IEP broad numbers of proficiency like 70% over and over and over, whether they're behavioral or academic, it is clear to me that specific baselines were not gathered, because again, it shouldn't be the same. The other piece is this. From a district standpoint, if you're auditing a case manager's IEPs and you're going through and looking at them, if all of the goals are set at 70% and all of the goals have the same language, there's a good chance they're not being individualized for the child. And unfortunately, software today can make us lazy when it comes to individualization. Ensure you don't have copy and paste. There's nothing more embarrassing than being in an IEP when the wrong kid's name is in the goal, and that happens way too often. So again, physical evidence should be available for that baseline. Are the annual goals linked to deficits identified in the PLAF? Again, those goals should be driven by the PLAF. If you're not going into detail and you have no data, again, how can you set data-based goals or short-term objectives? And also remember, if you have a kiddo with a behavioral emotional issue and they're on an alternative state assessment, remember they have to have the short-term objectives that go along with them. Are all major deficits identified in the FIE, the READ, the evaluation of current educational data, or PLAF, academic, functional, behavioral, are they linked again to the goals? So as I mentioned earlier, if I have a lot of data and it's triangulating to say that this kid has severe social issues, the child's moderately has autism and is, on the spectrum, kind of in the middle, it's moderate, has an impact, and again, really impacting the child's ability to socialize, understand facial cues, looking other kids in the eye, things of that nature. Again, do I have goals that address those deficits? Or do I have broad goals that don't match? Again, this goes into what I consider to be the component of reasonably calculated, because if you end up going to due process or get it challenged and you can't match up the deficits to the goals, to me, that is a major substantive violation or concern. So you really need to pay attention to that. Is it clear how the goals will be progress monitored and by whom? And here's my question. Could a new teacher pick up the IEP and implement it as written? Teach and measure goals. So here's what I find quite often. There's a lot of copy and paste language, and it's broad. So it'll say, again, Johnny's going to decrease his behavioral outbursts, and it's going to go from 6 to 2. Which is reasonable if you want to decrease a behavior. The thing is, when? Is it anytime? Is it in the morning? Is it in the afternoon? Because it could vary. How long are we going to measure it? Who's going to measure it? Is, if the child's in an inclusive setting, is it the regular ed teacher, the special ed teacher? Again, are you doing it every day, every week? By law, you have to, report it at either the 6 or 9 week, whenever the report cards go out. But what I find is copy and paste information. It's the same for every goal. It's the same for every teacher. And they're using their IEP software to just put the same thing down. It should be very clear in that goal how I'm going to measure, when I'm going to measure, with what I'm going to measure. And it shouldn't always be teacher-made quizzes and tests. Gang, they're not reliable. Sometimes they're valid, but they're not reliable. One teacher's assessment of math is going to be very different from another, and you can't track that over time. You can't truly progress monitor consistently with teacher-made quizzes and tests, and they also don't stand up very well. Are progress reports written to reflect the IEP goals accurately, specifically? Nothing is more frustrating to me than when I go into an IEP meeting and I'm looking at progress reports and I see a big P or a big W, and the big P is basically saying that the child's progressing. Well, how? That is absolutely not meaningful to any parent if you just say they are progressing, whether it be reading and oral reading fluency, and the child was in the 25th percentile on the normed component, and it just says progressing. Well, to what? Are they in the 35th percentile, the 50th percentile, the 80th percentile? And again, to me, when we look at the federal and state requirement for progress reporting, it's not this broad generic thing. Again, you need evidence and you need to be specific. The other piece is, remember, going back to substantive compliance and the two-part test of the Raleigh-Andrew two-part test, remember, it references progress, making progress. So you have to demonstrate the progress, and if ever challenged, you're going to have to show exactly how that child progressed. Is the method of progress monitoring defendable? Again, valid and reliable. My recommendation is to use standardized measures when possible. Now, not always. What I would recommend, for example, is getting relatively good new data when you can, such as the BASC-3. Now, you don't want to do that all the time, but what you want to be able to match up is that on a standardized instrument, you identified, say, socialization that was in the severe rating range by teacher or parent. And so you chose to track general socialization. Well, again, what you need to show is that you're progress monitoring it in a reasonable manner, reasonable time frame, that it's consistent, and that there's some general guidance provided of how it's being done. This is very important. Are work samples or reports of evidence available to support the progress reports? Again, when I go into IEPs, I want to see the actual work. I want to see the tool that was used to progress monitor, because depending on what you used, that can have a huge impact on what type of actual progress the child is making. If you give, let's say, a teacher-made assessment, and you give them a passage and a couple questions that's not on grade level, well, that might be one issue. If you're measuring, say, oral reading fluency with a curriculum-based measure and it's a 1-minute read, that's going to be a different measure. So again, we've got to make sure we're measuring consistently and we know how we're doing it. Do the weaknesses and baselines identified in the PLAF, do they link to the services being recommended? Again, what I quite often see, especially for behavioral kiddos, and this happens way too often, I will see that a child has mental health issues, has been cutting, has really internalizing and externalizing behaviors, and it'll go on and on to discuss all of the issues the child's having, the discipline issues they're having, the struggle the school's having with the child. And then I will see every 6 weeks, the child has a 10-minute psychological consult. So here's my question, and to me, what would be a very reasonable question as a parent. What is a 10-minute consult every 6 weeks going to do to meet the needs of this child if the needs are this severe? It doesn't match up. And again, that comes back to internal consistency. And what I would argue is the reasonably calculated requirement under that two-part test and under coming out of the Andrew F. case. Again, it's not reasonably calculated if you identify severe needs with de minimis services. So again, it needs to make sense. If you have minimum needs and you're putting the child in a self-contained environment and providing them with intensive supports, well, you're probably violating their least restrictive environment. So again, minimal needs, probably full inclusion, maybe full regular ed with limited supports. So again, it needs to just make sense. It needs to be commonsensical. So again, these are absolutely huge aspects of it. The degree of need should match the degree of services and supports. Absolutely essential. Again, moving on was our substantive compliance. And again, remember, gang, when it comes to kids with behavioral emotional disorders, procedural things are going to matter to protect the parents and the child's rights, but the most important is substantive, because again, remember, procedural errors do not necessarily mean there's a FAPE violation. It has to have a substantial or substantive impact and be a substantive violation in order to be a FAPE violation. If the child has more than 2 disciplinary referrals, now this is just Kurt's means of management. I was a principal for a number of years, and neither federal nor state regulations tell you when you need to conduct an FBA or put a BIP in place. It just says that if there's a need, you have to do it. So what I did was, the minute I suspected a pattern and the minute I saw 2 disciplinary referrals or serious behavioral needs, I would recommend an FBA and or a BIP. And of course, that's a functional behavioral assessment to determine, what's the antecedent, what's the behavior, what's the consequence. The FBA is to really understand the behavior, and then the BIP is the plan. Well, here's again what I find is that we have a lot of FBAs where no practitioner, no teacher has ever read or had access to. What is the point of an FBA if nobody in the trenches doing the work has access to it? Make sure your folks are reading these things. And then BIP. I have been in more IEPs when I ask the regular ed teachers to tell me about the BIP. 98% of the time, they've never even seen the BIP. That's problematic. So the other piece is, when it comes to a BIP, you need evidence that it's being implemented. A lot of BIPs go into a lot of detail. If it's requiring intervention and certain supports, you need to have evidence of that. So don't take the BIP lightly. It is super important, because with behavioral kiddos, again, in my experience, 90 to 95% of the time, if there is a major disciplinary issue, it is found to be a manifestation of the disability. Again, when you're dealing with behavioral or emotional disorders, very important. Is data available to prove the implementation of the BIP? Again, if you're challenged, remember, in due process or a state complaint, when it's being evaluated in these environments, the data is what speaks. Not just anecdotal information of, well, yeah, I did it. If the parent's saying it wasn't followed, you're going to have to prove the evidence. Now, the burden of proof is on the parent, but every single due process hearing I've ever been to, whatever the parent's challenge, the school ends up having to prove the opposite. So to me, the burden of proof is most often on the school district. For behavioral kiddos and social skills training, meaning with a curriculum being taught regularly, is it? So here's another piece that I find all the time. We will track certain behaviors and we will want to see a decrease in undesirable behaviors, right? So that's reasonable. However, what we don't always do is teach the replacement behaviors. So, and the idea is that we're going to discipline it out of the kids or put them on a point system that's going to change that behavior. Gang, if we don't teach the kiddos different approaches, they're going to continue to use and do what they've learned and what they know. So make sure that you have social skills training and supports in there. Here's the other thing. It shouldn't be teachable moments. The idea that it's just going to be taught when the kiddo is struggling and the teacher sees an opportunity. It needs to be a structured period of time based on need. Again, severe need means more support and training. Less severity and need means less support and training. So, but make sure there's a curriculum. It needs to be evidence-based, not the teacher's thoughts around when and where and how and what should be implemented. So focus strongly on that. And I will give you an example. of also don't be cookie cutter. So I have personally seen an enormous rise in mental health issues and kiddos with borderline, kiddos with depression and anxiety, and all of these mental health issues impact their behavior in the classroom. And there are certain approaches out there, such as dialectical behavioral therapy, that has to be provided by a licensed therapist. However, kind of the superstar researcher of that area, Marsha Linehan, has super practical strategies and lesson plans, essentially, that can be implemented in a school-based setting. So really identify the kiddos' needs and then apply strategies and research-based interventions that we know can and will work with our kiddos. Again, we can't discipline it out of kids. We have to replace that behavior. And on that topic, let me discuss goals. So are the IEP behavior goals measuring meaningful areas? And what I find is that, again, we'll have a kiddo with major emotional behavioral issues, and we have one behavior goal. You know, Johnny's going to attend to task, or Johnny isn't going to have verbal outbursts. Johnny won't be disruptive, whatever it may be. So to me, what I like to do very simply, and there are probably different thoughts on this, but again, it needs to be common sense and reasonably developed. So in the school-based environment, again, having spent a lot of time as a building principal, you want to extinguish or decrease undesirable behaviors, because those can be the most disruptive to that child and to other children. So what I like to do in IEPs is identify those undesirable behaviors. And let's say there are 3 primary undesirable behaviors. Well, I need to get a baseline of how often these are occurring, make sure that is in the PLAF. Then what you want to do is write goals about decreasing. So if you have 10 verbal outbursts a day and you want them to get down to 2 by the end of the year, it's pretty reasonable. You want to track the decrease of that behavior. Now, if you want that child to decrease that, you have to have a replacement behavior. And what I like to do is then have a corresponding goal that is the replacement behavior that's going to track the pro-social behavior. So then I want to see an increase in positive interactions, using their voice, using strategies, and I want to see an increase in that behavior. So again, I would have 3 undesirable behaviors I want to see decreased, and then I'm going to track, and then I want to see 3 reasonable, appropriate behaviors increased. And then what I want to make sure of is, for the actual behaviors I want to see increased, I want to be teaching those in a social skills environment, whether it be daily, weekly, a couple times a week, whatever is reasonable based on the severity of the need. We should have those social skills in there. So the other piece is this: the BIP needs to align with that. So if you're identifying all of these goals to decrease and increase, then the BIP needs to have interventions that'll address those areas. And then you need to have data being tracked to do that. So once again, this has to do, in my opinion, and address the issue of reasonably calculated, which is in that second part of the substantive compliance component of the 2-part test that are used by hearing officers in courts. So stay focused on that term, reasonably calculated, and progress. You have to demonstrate progress. And again, if you don't get that baseline in that PLAF, how are you going to measure progress? And it would be quite easy to go into a due process hearing and say, there's no baseline data. They couldn't possibly measure progress because they didn't even know where they began. Much like the example I gave about losing weight, if I want to lose 30 pounds by the end of the year and I have to demonstrate that growth or that loss, I've got to know what I weighed to begin with, right? Because again, the idea is this: if I'm not losing weight, a couple weeks in or a month in, then I need to adjust the intervention. And that brings me to another issue that is super important to address. And that is, when we are implementing IEPs, it's not once a year that we evaluate it. If when we get to that 6 or 9 week point after we've been collecting data on our goals and we see that the child isn't progressing, then we need to either adjust the intervention, or if they've made tons of progress and they've mastered it, we need to adjust and see if is there another area, but we can discontinue that goal. So often what I see is that the goals have either been mastered or the kid's not making progress and no change was made. This is a dynamic, living, breathing document. It is a contract, and it is very easy to argue, again, if the behavior is not changing and improving, that the implementation component of the compliance piece is potentially in violation. So again, I know this is a lot to take in, but in my opinion, what we're discussing here, one, it matters from the standpoint of compliance and whether or not you're found to have a FAPE violation for a kiddo. And the most important piece is that it drives the quality of the programming. So a robust PLAF means we've really identified the kiddo's needs, just like a physician does diagnostic testing, does all the blood work, determines if the child has a need. Then the goals is just like a physician who's going to do, whether it be surgery, medication, whatever that treatment plan is, that's huge. Then, of course, that doctor is going to track your progress. If you're not getting better, what are they going to do? They're going to adjust your meds. They're going to adjust their approach. So it is very similar to that medical process. And think about this. If the kiddo goes to a doctor, they're sick at the beginning of the year, they do all the diagnostics and they find out the kiddo has cancer, and the treatment plan is radiation and medication. And basically the child never makes progress. The child never grows. The child never gets better. And the doctor never adjusts the medication or the approach. Is that reasonable? Is that appropriate? Well, I would argue that it's not, that a doctor should probably make an adjustment when they determine their treatment isn't working for that child. So think of it in that light. And here's the other thing. It's not a silly comparison. You know, I once heard somebody say we're doing basically brain surgery for 13 years, K through 12. You know, we are dealing with, if a child with a behavioral disorder doesn't get support and doesn't get the right skills, this will impact them for the rest of their lives. Their ability to maintain positive relationships, their ability to maintain a job, their ability to provide for themselves, their ability to create a happy life. So we can't minimize the importance of substantive compliance in the development of a quality IEP. So a couple of other just important topics before we run out of time that I want to address. Is it clear how data are being tracked and monitored? Again, quite often I get in there and the gen ed teachers don't know who's collecting data. They're not collecting data. The special ed teacher's not exactly sure because it wasn't made clear in the document or the IEP, and there's broad, vague language. Is there evidence of tracking data? Again, we have to show that we're collecting the data in regular intervals. For those 14 and older, is the transition goal meaningful with evidence-based outcomes? So this is one of our greatest challenges. I quite often see, high school kids with behavioral issues, and their transition plan is Johnny will search on the internet for his career, and that's it. And there's no implementation, there's no tracking of anything. And here's the deal: transition was put into place with IDEA because our kiddos weren't getting jobs, they weren't getting employed, they weren't providing for themselves. This is no small issue. So we've got to have reasonable goals, we've got to actually implement it, and we've got to track their performance when it comes to transition. So don't ignore this for your kiddos that are at that 14-year range and older. Per case manager, are the goals significantly different for each child, or is there evidence of copy and paste, drop-down selection, overuse, and or reuse? So this is a big bugaboo. Think about the term IEP. Special education completely revolves around the concept of individualization. General ed is just that. It's general, it's generic, it's broad-based and intended to manage thousands of kids in a general education population in a school district. Special ed is supposed to be unique to that child's needs. If you have the same goals for all 15 kids on your caseload, probably the issue is that it's not individualized for each kid. And that would be very easy evidence that it's not being individualized. So if you're a special ed director, pull a few IEPs, take a look and see by case manager if there is clear individualization. Now, here's the other piece. Comprehension is super important. Oral reading fluency is super important. With behavior, compliance is super important. It's okay to have similar focal areas based on a disability, but here's the deal. What should be different is the baseline and the PLAF every time. It is very unlikely that every child has 5 verbal outbursts a day. It's very likely they vary. Therefore, their goals should be different, although maybe with the same focal areas. So that's just a very important concept to remember. And again, if you're not individualizing, that is a substantive compliance issue and likely a FAPE violation. Do teachers have to turn in their progress monitoring reports to a supervisor? One of the things I found in most of the districts I worked was that we were not sending home progress reports all the time, and we didn't have detailed reporting in the progress reports. It's very important that parents understand how the child's progressing and that we have evidence to support exactly what we're doing. So these are all super critical. Remember, substantive compliance is what truly matters. The hearing officers in the courts, if it ever elevates to that level, they're going to look at first procedural, then they're going to look at substantive, as well as a component of that will be the implementation component. But substantive, by far the most important, and legally and morally. If you don't have a quality program set up, how can you really support and serve the kiddo? I hope what I've discussed today has been helpful. I have been doing this a long time. I absolutely love it. And if I can leave you with one note, it's really wonderful to be speaking with folks from the great state of South Carolina and I'm sure beyond. But working with this group is really exciting, as there are some of the greatest minds in special education currently and historically have come out of South Carolina. And there's a gentleman, Dr. Mitchell Yell, who I've been following and reading for the past 25 years, who hails from the great state of South Carolina. And his work is absolutely brilliant around these issues of substantive compliance and the importance of them. So well done, South Carolina. Keep turning out the great leaders, researchers, and practitioners. And thank you so much. Send your questions. I will get them answered to the best of my ability. And if I don't know, I'll ask somebody like Dr. Yell or some of the other experts in the field, and I'll get those right to you. Take care.